You're welcome. All right, so he begins with the Nile being turned into blood. All right, as the Nile is turned into blood, there's this affront against the Nile River, which itself was worshipped in many different ways, right? But the magicians of Egypt are apparently, or at least they think they're clever, and so it says, the Bible tells us that they do the same thing. Now, I'm not sure what that accomplished. You just have twice as much blood as you had the first time, right? So God even uses these people to make the plagues even harder on Egypt than they were in the first place. After the blood, you have the frogs. The frogs come up out of the river, and they were a sign of the fertility of the Nile River basin. And many of we have these little idols in Egyptian history that look like frogs. And so frogs come from everywhere, all over the place. They're just frogs all over, except for the land of Goshen, where the people of Israel dwelt. It's like God puts his hand over his people, and he afflicts everyone else. After the frogs come the gnats. After the gnats, gnats so that you can't see the sky. After the gnats come the flies. After the flies, the livestock die. Now, I want you to just for a moment put yourself in Israel right now. This is not Egypt, sorry. This is not a great place to live, right? You've got flies and gnats and frogs, and all the livestock die. After that, the people are afflicted with boils. Everyone except for God's people in the land of Goshen. These horrible boils all over their bodies. After this, the hail comes because the people of Egypt would have said, well, maybe our livestock died, but we still have the crops. We'll still be okay. And what God is doing is he's systematically undoing all the blessings they received because of Joseph dwelling in the land. Right? All of those things that they got because they honored Joseph and they honored the Lord, God is systematically just removing from Egypt. Right? So after the hail, there would have been a few crops left until the locusts came, which was the next plague, and wipes out all of Egypt's livelihood. It's at this point that the magicians of Egypt, who had been able to imitate a few but not all of the plagues, look at Pharaoh in chapter 10 and say, how long shall this man be a snare to us? Do you not see that Egypt is ruined? In other words, you stubborn king, can you not see what is happening here? And these are the people who are trying to imitate the things that God was doing. And early on they said, nope, this is the finger of God. We can't do this. And they warned the Pharaoh, but Pharaoh's heart continues to be hard, and so God makes this systematic strike. It's like a tomahawk cruise missile against the highest god of Egyptian mythology, and the sun is struck dark. It says that darkness is heavy in the land of Egypt, everywhere except for the land of Goshen, where God's people dwelt. And so finally you get to chapter 11, where God has won a victory against all of these false gods, which aren't gods at all, of Egypt. He has over and over proven himself to be superior to Pharaoh, to Egypt, to the Egyptian magicians, to all of these things. He's proven that he is God over all. But Pharaoh continuing to do exactly what Pharaoh wants to do while God continues to harden his heart. Jeff talked a lot about that this morning in Equip. You should come to Equip. You learned all about it. And so as these things are both happening, Pharaoh's doing exactly what he wants to do. God is continuing to harden Pharaoh's heart. You get to chapter 11, and God speaks to Moses and says, one more plague. There will be one more, and I will strike dead all of the firstborn. And so you begin chapter 12 on the cusp of the promise of the people that God said he was going to set his people free. They are now getting ready to be set free. So you feel a sense of urgency in chapter 12. Everything happens in a hurry at this point, and then it's like 40 years, right? It's quick. You remember we're talking about God's timetable last week, how it's these long, protracted periods of waiting, and then all of a sudden, everything happens, and then it's going to be it's going to be more waiting. That's just kind of how it works. That's how God's plan works. It's how God's timetable works. But as we begin chapter 12, there are a host of things that are going to be changing because of the Passover, because of what God is getting ready to do. And I want us to see what's changing. So we're going to read together through the chapter. So just keep your Bibles open to Exodus 12. But here's the first thing that changes. The first thing that changes. The Passover is going to change who these people are. Let's start in verse 1. Let's read the first 6 verses. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, this month shall be for you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year for you. Tell all the congregation of Israel that on the 10th day of this month every man shall take a lamb according to their father's houses, a lamb for his household, and if the household is too small for a lamb, then he and his nearest neighbor shall take according to the number of persons. According to what each can eat, you shall make your count for the lamb. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male, a year old. You may take it from the sheep, or from the goats, and you shall keep it until the 14th day of this month, when the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill their lambs at twilight. Excuse me. And then verse 14, we're going to skip down a little bit. I want to read these two sections together. Verse 14, this day shall be for you a memorial day, and you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord throughout your generations, as a statute forever. You shall keep it as a feast. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall remove leaven out of your house. For if anyone eats what is leavened from the first day to the 7th day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. On the first day you shall hold a holy assembly, and on the 7th day a holy assembly. No work shall be done on those days, but what everyone needs to eat, that alone may be prepared by you, and you shall observe the feast of unleavened bread. For on this very day I brought your hosts out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe this day throughout your generations as a statute forever. In the first month, from the 14th day of the month at evening, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at evening. For 7 days no leaven is to be found in your houses. If anyone eats what is leavened, that person will be cut off from the congregation of Israel, whether he is a sojourner or a native of the land. You shall eat nothing leavened in all your dwelling places. You shall eat unleavened bread. This is a new beginning for Israel, right? So from the very outset, he said, this month shall be for you the beginning of months. Whether or not they had calendars in Egypt, they had one now, and this was the first month, and this is the first thing you celebrate in the first month in the Jewish calendar. Now, how cool is that? Like, I'm not particularly complaining about our calendar, but we end our year with a reminder of God's promises. They began their year with a reminder of God's promises. They began their whole calendar. Everything about their days, you get this, everything about every day that the Jewish person would have celebrated was oriented around this reminder of God's promises, because this starts the year. And rightly so. Everything's changing about the children of Israel, right? They're moving from being slaves to being free. This all is being made possible by the work of God. And they were supposed to celebrate those new beginnings every single year. And so, there's so much instruction here about how to celebrate it. Because God is saying, this is a big deal. Treat it like it's a big deal. They don't even know what's happening yet. Like, they haven't even gotten instructions about what's getting ready to happen. All they know is God going, listen, this is important, which means we should listen because it's important. Now, what's interesting is when he describes this holiday with even these new beginnings, they were to take this whole week, 7 days, no work. Now, we think of the beginning of the year, we think January. The beginning of the year in the Jewish calendar was actually more like March or April, at the very beginning of the growing season. So now let me get you, now get this picture. Here's what God's asking Israel to do. Every single year, at the very beginning of the growing season, I want you to take one whole week off, not do any work, and just observe the Passover. Now, keep in mind again that Israel is primarily an agricultural society, and I know we have some folks in here who enjoy agriculture. Imagine the sacrifice that's required of taking that whole week off. And you're getting a picture of the faith that God is asking Israel to have. And now you'll see why. You'll have whole stretches in the Old Testament where they never celebrated the Passover. And so it becomes a big deal, particularly at the end of Israel's life, when you have a king like Hezekiah, for instance, or Josiah, who reinstitute the Passover. Because they were like, well, this is too hard. It's too hard for me to miss a whole week of work to go to church. I'm not going to do that. And so they didn't. They didn't do it. But they're supposed to. Everything was supposed to orient around them because it's supposed to be costly. It's supposed to require faith. They're supposed to trust that God is going to provide. And they were to help each other remember. So you see neighbor to neighbor, everybody helping one another to be sure that everyone could celebrate this thing. That's how it's supposed to happen. And the reason why is because not only was this a new beginning for them, they were getting a new name. It's easy to pass over, pun fully intended, how significant verse 3 is. Let's look at verse 3 again. Look at this. Tell all the congregation of Israel. That phrase had never been used before. Up until then, they were the children of Israel. They might have been the people of Israel. They might have been the children of Jacob. They might have been the slaves in Israel. But here, right here, God calls them a congregation. There is a fundamental name change that is a picture of what God is doing for His people. The celebration of the Passover year after year reminds them that God doesn't see them as slaves in Egypt. He sees them as a people of His own possession. The celebration reminded them that they were unified under the grace of God. What did Israel deserve? Nothing. What did they get from the mighty hand of God? Freedom. Preservation of their firstborn. Land of promise. All by the grace of God. It was God's mercy to pass over them. As we look at what's happening at the Passover, I want you to keep that in mind first. It was God's mercy that caused Him to pass over the families of Israel. And when the death angel comes, it's not just because of the blood, it is, but it's because of God's mercy that they were spared. And with that new name, with this new beginning, comes a new identity. And so they were called year after year after year after year to celebrate the new beginning that God had given them because of His grace and by His mercy, to call them together to be a people, to remember His goodness, and to remember that redemption that would come because of His grace. Now, that sounds a lot like why we should celebrate Christmas too, doesn't it? Shouldn't that be what our holiday is? Shouldn't that be why we stop and disrupt our daily schedules and our normal routines to think about the goodness and grace of God? That's exactly why days like this matter. The reality is we remember the important days, right? We remember the day we were married. We may not remember the whole day we were married because we were pretty nervous, but we remember some things about the day. We at least remembered that we were married on a day, right? We remember the day our children were born. We remember hard days. Remember the day we lose people that we love. We remember those things because they matter, because they change us. The primary reason, get this, the primary reason the Christian celebrates Christmas is because for the Christian, Christmas changed you. The coming of Christ and the work of Christ has changed you and made you something different. And that's why you celebrate it. You don't celebrate it because it comes on December 25th and the federal government has decided it is a holiday. The federal government does not get to celebrate, it does not get to appoint holy days. That's God's work. And so we celebrate Christmas because it has changed us. It has transformed us forever. Not because of wrappings or bows or trees or lights, but because of Christ. It reminds us of what we have received because of Christ. That we, too, have new beginnings. You are different because of Christ, Christian. Now, if you're here and you're not a Christian, you're not any different. And Christmas doesn't really matter. But if you're here and you profess the name of Jesus Christ, then it matters. It matters that Christ broke into history and redeemed your soul. That matters. And it's worth stopping to remember and celebrate. But it doesn't just change who the people were, the Passover did. Passover also changed what the people believed. So let's look at verse 7. We're going to back up. Look at verse 7 through verse 13. Then they shall take some of the blood and put it on the two doorposts and the lintel of the houses in which they eat it. They shall eat the flesh that night, roasted on the fire, with unleavened bread and bitter herbs they shall eat it. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled in water, but roasted, its head with its legs and its inner parts, and you shall let none of it remain until the morning. Anything that remains until the morning you shall burn. In this manner you shall eat it, with your belt fastened, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover, for I will pass through the land of Egypt that night. And I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you. And no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. Now jump over to verse 21. Verse 21. Then Moses called all the elders of Israel and said to them, go and select lambs for yourself, according to your clans, and kill the Passover lamb. Take a bunch of hyssop and dip it in the blood that is in the basin, and touch the lintel and the two doorposts with the blood that is in the basin. None of you shall go out of the door of his house until the morning, for the Lord will pass through to strike the Egyptians. And when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the two doorposts, the Lord will pass over the door and will not allow the destroyer to enter your houses to strike you. You shall observe this as a statute for you and for your sons forever. And when you come to the land that the Lord will give you, as he has promised, you shall keep this service. And when your children say to you, what do you mean by this service? You shall say, it is the sacrifice of the Lord's Passover. For he passed over the houses of Israel in Egypt when he struck the Egyptians, but spared our houses. And the people bowed their heads and worshipped. And then verse 28, and the people of Israel went and did so, as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron. So they did. If you could imagine, just for a second, that in 1590, the year 1590, someone made a promise to your family and told them, in 430 years, you're going to have to pack everything up and go. Right? And when the time is right, I'm going to tell you, someone's going to tell you, and your descendants are going to have to be willing to pack everything up and leave and go where I'm going to show them. Right? Now imagine, fast forward, it's now this year, 2022, and somebody comes up and knocks on your door and says, hey, you remember that promise 430 years ago? It's time. And now you got to pack it up and go. We're really hard on Israel a lot because they're really stubborn people, kind of like us. But it's also helpful to put into perspective exactly what it was the Lord was asking them to do. For 430 years, they lived in Egypt. There was nobody alive at this time that was alive when they got there. Right? In the same sort of way that all of the pilgrims are dead. Right? I mean, they're all gone. We celebrate their stories and we think it's really cool. But if somebody walked up to your door and said, we told the pilgrims to do this and now it's time to do it, you'd have a hard time, right? Like, it's really, really important to understand exactly what it is that's happening with Israel here. Because we condense the timeline because it takes us like 10 minutes to read it. It took 430 years to accomplish it. Okay? So we gotta start there. So there's a lot of faith that is being required of Israel. And we're going to see them stumble out of the gate and stumble through the wilderness and then stumble in the promised land and then stumble over and over again. And that's kind of the story of humanity, right? Not just the story of Israel. That's the story of us too. But it's important to understand what's going on here because God is making sure through all of this that they understand that he is God. Because you know what else happens when you live somewhere for 430 years? You can sort of take on the practices of the people that you're around. This is a thing that Israel would have been very prone to do. They would have been prone to worship the same gods that the Egyptians worshipped. In fact, if you fast forward in the book of Exodus to Exodus chapter 32, you're going to read this really horrible story about Moses going up to the mountain to get the commandments of God and Aaron being there and the people saying, we want you to fashion for us a calf so that we can worship it. And so according to Aaron, he just got this gold together and threw it in the fire and poof, out popped this calf. Now, we all know better. That's not how it happened, right? He made it. In fact, he didn't just make it. He made the altar for them to worship, right? He did it all. He did it all. But in all of this, why would they make a calf? Why a calf? They didn't just pick a random animal. They picked an animal that they already were worshiping in Egypt because the calf was a sign of fertility. And when you're in an agricultural society, you figure you need all the help you can get. And so they created this calf. And so there was a lot here in all of the plagues. Understand that one of the roles of the plagues was not just to afflict Egypt, but to show Israel, to teach Israel that there is one God, and it is the God of Abraham and of Isaac and of Jacob. And so we see that happening here again, right? Verse 12, we see that he's going to strike both man and beast, right? He says, I will pass through the land of Egypt, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. Now, why would he do that? Because he is showing that all the firstborn belong to him, right? But on top of that, he's also showing them that there's only one God. Now, it's always important when you talk through a chapter like this in the book of Exodus to talk about the fact that this is not simply some sort of Old Testament ethnic cleansing, because this is a pretty common line of argument, if you will, in the secular world. What's really important to note here is that when God gives these instructions, he makes it clear that that even the Israelite who did not put the blood on the lintel and the doorpost, they also would be afflicted. Right? This is not God's judgment against just Egypt. This is God's judgment against disobedience. And he would have included Israel in that as well, if they were disobedient to what he says to do. And so he gives these instructions, right, which are fascinating to think through and read through, right? You've got the lamb. And again, we talked about this last week, that it's easy to sanitize these stories. For just a moment, let your imagination go to the gore that was involved in this story. Because without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sin. It's good for us to remind ourselves of this, because we've sanctified, in an unhealthy sort of way, we've cleaned up the Bible stories. This is a lamb, right? This is a cute little baby animal that was killed in order to spare the firstborn of these families, right? As that animal was killed, its blood was drained. As its blood was drained, they took hyssop, which is kind of like broom straw. If you ever see an old-fashioned broom, right? And what they would do, I'm going to walk over here for just a second, just to the camera. If you're watching on YouTube, I'll be right back. All right, so what happens, this is the closest door, so it's the easiest way to figure it out, okay? So doorposts, the vertical beams, lintel would have been the horizontal one, right? Now, what's really important to understand, when they did this, they would strike lintel first, doorpost, doorpost. That's it. So boom, boom, boom. There are a couple of reasons for that. Let me help you, give you a, thinking about architecture helps. I get so excited. I got to figure out which sentence I want to say first, okay? So, in Egyptian culture, let's start there. In Egyptian culture, your name mattered immensely. In fact, there are tons of Egyptian architecture where if you got really, really mad at your ancestor, what you would do is you'd find something with their name on it and you'd erase it. And if you did that, you erased them from eternity. It's crazy, right? But that's what they thought. It's what they believed. In fact, you see this happening with even the pharaohs. You go into the pyramids, and there are places where there's these lists of pharaohs, and they would etch their name into stone, right? Because it's hard to erase things off of stone. I don't know if you've ever tried, but it's hard. And so you'd see them, like they'd be in here with chisels trying to chisel away the names of the people they didn't like in the tombs, because they believed if they did that, they would no longer exist in eternity. And so because the Egyptians put so much weight in the name, we put weight in the name. The Israelites put weight in the name, but not for the same reason. What they would do is the only permanent part of an Israelite's house, both in Goshen, and interesting, they took this with them to Israel. Only permanent part of their house was a doorpost. Now, this kind of makes sense to us, because that wall is mostly sheetrock. And I don't know if you've ever hit like your head against sheetrock, or you accidentally put your hand too hard on sheetrock, but or maybe your kids threw the door open too hard. Sheetrock is a lot of things. Permanent is not one of them, right? We carry this over even into the way we build houses, so that door is permanent. But what the Israelites would do is, in order to identify, their version of a doormat was to take the name and write it across the lintel, the horizontal piece of the doorpost, right? So if you go to my house right now, it says Merry Christmas. If you go to my house after Christmas, it says Welcome to the Catos, right? There's this doormat, so you know who I am. They did that up here. Now, when they put the blood on the door, they would put it this way. But the most important strike was across the lintel, because across the lintel, the blood of the lamb went across the name of the family that was being preserved. Now, is that cool or what? That's pretty awesome, right? Because now, so you see the symbolism, right? You've got this spotless lamb. The lamb was slain. The blood of the lamb covers the name of the people that are being preserved by God. So now you go forward to the book of Revelation, you get this picture of the Lamb's book of life. It's all this really cool stuff. It all does this. It's not a whole bunch of disconnected stories, right? The Bible is one big interconnected story from Genesis to Revelation about God's redemptive work. And so every family had to do this. This is why it was such a big deal when Moses said, stay in your house, right? Because they had to stand behind the name that was covered by the blood of the Lamb in order to be spared from death. It's just unbelievable, right? You see all of this symbolism everywhere. But all of this would have required faith from the people, right? Moses is just telling them to do something they've literally never done before. And, by the way, to do it with your boots on and your staff in your hand, because once it's time to go, it's time to go. We're just going to have to go. And they're like, okay, and so they do this. But all of this, God is at war against idolatry. And he's not primarily and only at war against the idolatry of Egypt. He is at war against the idolatry of his own people. Because there were many people here that needed to be reminded that God was the God of life and death. Because every single Egyptian god was carefully crafted to either control death or manipulate life. Because that is the essence of idolatry, to try to control things that are fundamentally outside of our control. Now, I don't know anybody that worships frogs and rivers. I don't know anybody that has a little golden calf in their living room. But I do know that a lot of the same questions that the Egyptians would have been asking about how to manipulate life and control death, our culture asks every day. Think about some of the questions that advertisers, for instance, want to help you answer by you putting your hope and trust in the thing that they're selling. How can I live longer? Boy, is that the question, right? The cosmetic industry stands as a permanent testimony of the fact that everybody asks that question. How can I live longer and look younger? How can I be secure? Financially secure? Physically secure? How can I stay healthy? So can we, a over concern with our physical health. How can I ensure my prosperity? And ultimately, you wrap it all up with, how can I have happiness? How can I be happy? These questions are not foreign to Egypt, nor are they foreign to us. These are the same questions that Egypt fashioned their idols out of. They're the same questions that we fashion idols for as well. And so God shows them and shows us that there is faith required. Death is a problem in the Passover. And the only solution is not simply just to put blood on a door, but to trust God. Death is the problem for us all. And there's only one solution. And there's only one hope for that solution. But it requires belief. And the Passover changed the belief of the people. And so it was observed every year. And so they stopped to remind themselves of this. But it didn't just change that. It changed their standing. It changed where they stood before God. Let's read 4 more verses, 29 through 32 of Exodus chapter 12. At midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on his throne, to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the livestock. And Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians. And there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where someone was not dead. Then he summoned Moses and Aaron by night. And he said, Up, go out from among my people, both you and the people of Israel, and go serve the Lord as you have said. Take your flocks and your herds, as you have said, and be gone, and bless me also. In other words, this is it. They're going. Now you get why they had to have their boots on, right? Because we know in just a couple of chapters what's going to happen. Pharaoh's going to change his mind. So they need to get on out of there to accomplish exactly what it was that God intended to accomplish. It's a sanctified and providential hurry, right? They got to head out because they're heading out fast according to the plan of God. But this changes them. Think about how everything has changed for the people because of the Passover lamb. They stood under death at the threat of the death angel, but when they stand under the blood, they're spared. They lived in slavery. But through the blood of the Lamb, they find freedom to be exactly what God has intended them to be. They were burdened under the weight of oppression. But through the blood of the Lamb, they took on the yoke of being the people of God. All through a lamb given to each family, killed and eaten with its blood smeared on the doorpost and the lintels. But we know there's more, right? Can't simply be a lamb. We'll read forward in the book of Hebrews that the blood of bulls and goats could never forgive sin. It's got to be more to it than just a lamb. And there is. And so, Exodus last week points us to God's great mercy in delivering his people this week. Exodus 12 points us forward, not to a literal, physical, four-legged lamb, but to the great proclamation that David read for us this morning. That as Jesus comes before John the Baptist immediately, the forerunner for the Messiah, the precursor to Christ, could look at him and say what? Of all the things he could have said, behold the Lamb of God who comes to take away the sin of the world. Now, why in the world did he say that? He said that because he recognized exactly who Jesus was, the ultimate Passover lamb who would come and take away the sin of the world. All of Israel, for all of its history, was to have the institution of a holiday that reminded them of the day when God spared the firstborn of all Israel by killing a lamb, so that one day they would see and we would know that God would spare all of his people by not sparing his one and only Son. That is the picture. We are made safe because of blood. Just like every family in Israel would have looked at the doorposts and the lintels and said, this blood makes me safe. We, as Christians, look at the cross and say, that blood makes me safe. Your biggest problem is death, and your only hope is Christ. And that's the story, not just of the Passover. That's the story of Christmas, friends. It's more than just a cradle. He came as an infant, and we certainly should sing and think on and meditate on that, because what a mystery. How does God take on flesh? I don't know. My brain is too small to possibly comprehend those mysteries. Those mysteries are above my pay grade, but they are 100% true and 100% truth. But we as Christians cannot simply stop at the cradle, right? He was certainly born, fully God, fully man. But we, like John the Baptist, know exactly what's going to happen. He will live the life that you can't live, free from sin, resisting temptations that will derail you every single day for the rest of your life. He would die for our sin, taking on the sin that I've committed on his body and thus bearing the wrath of God for me. And then he will be raised from the dead on the third day, ascend into heaven, and now he reigns as King Jesus. We have the whole story. See, for the Christian, Christmas is not simply cradle. For the Christian, Christmas is cradle, cross, and crown, all together. It's all of it together. Remembering who Jesus is and what Jesus has done. And friends, that's worth disrupting our work schedule over. It's worth stopping and being interrupted with what we think is important in life and just considering Jesus. John the Baptist beheld the Lamb of God, and so should we. So, how do we do that? How do we celebrate Christ at Christmas? It seems ironic, doesn't it, that I would even say that. What you are because of Christ. Utilize this Advent season, this time of waiting, as we said again this morning, to just consider what Christ has done for you. We who are not a people are now the people of God. We who were lost are now found. Christmas is a yearly and annual holiday set aside for the